It is early November 1775, and a column of nearly 700 starving men is dragging what is left of their boats through a Maine wilderness that has no name on any map they carry. They have been marching for 6 weeks. They started with over 1,100 soldiers. More than 400 of them are already gone, dead, deserted, or turned back. The ones still standing have eaten their shoe leather. Some have eaten their dogs. The temperature is dropping below freezing every night, and the nearest friendly town is still 100 miles away through country that has swallowed armies before and will not hesitate to swallow this one. Their commander, a 34-year-old former apothecary from Connecticut, is somewhere at the front of the column, refusing to admit that the maps he purchased before the expedition began were wrong about almost everything that mattered. His name was Benedict Arnold, and 6 years before he would become the most hated traitor in American history, he was about to attempt one of the most audacious military marches ever undertaken on the North American continent. What happened to his army in the wilderness of Maine would test the limits of human endurance, and almost none of it should have been survivable. The plan was born in the summer of 1775, just months after the shooting started at Lexington and Concord. George Washington had just taken command of the Continental Army outside Boston, and the strategic picture facing the rebellion was not good. The British held Boston. The British held the Atlantic seaboard's best harbors, and to the north, the British held Canada, a base from which they could pour troops and supplies down into New York whenever they chose. American commanders, including Washington himself, became convinced that Canada represented both a threat and an opportunity. If the 14th colony could be pulled into the rebellion or simply conquered before the British could reinforce it, the entire northern flank of the war would collapse in America's favor. 2 expeditions were authorized. The first, a more conventional force under General Richard Montgomery, would move north along the traditional invasion corridor through Lake Champlain toward Montreal. The second was Arnold's idea, and it was audacious even by the standards of a revolution built on audacious ideas. Arnold proposed marching a separate force directly through the wilderness of Maine, up the Kennebec River, across a series of unmapped ponds and portages, and down the Chaudière River into Quebec City itself. If it worked, 2 American armies would converge on British Canada from different directions at almost the same time, catching Quebec's defenses completely unprepared. Washington approved the plan and gave Arnold roughly 1,100 men, a mix of New England militia and several rifle companies from Virginia and Pennsylvania under officers, including Daniel Morgan, the same frontier marksman who would later engineer the trap at Cowpens. Arnold purchased 200 bateaux, flat-bottomed boats built hastily and cheaply from green, unseasoned lumber in the town of Pittston, Maine. Those boats would fail his men almost immediately, and the failure would set the tone for everything that followed. The expedition departed from Newburyport, Massachusetts by sea in September 1775, landing at the mouth of the Kennebec River before beginning the overland and river portion of the march. From the very first days, the green lumber boats began to warp, crack, and take on water. Soldiers had to constantly bail, repair, and in many cases completely rebuild boats that were falling apart under them within days of construction. Worse, Arnold was relying on a survey map drawn decades earlier by a British military engineer named John Montresor. That map dramatically underestimated the distance to Quebec and misrepresented the network of ponds, portages, and river branches the army would need to navigate. Arnold believed the march would take about 20 days. It would take 45. The terrain itself was almost designed to break an army. The Kennebec River was shallow and choked with rapids that required men to wade into freezing water up to their chests, hauling boats loaded with supplies over rock beds that tore boots apart within a week. When the river gave out, the men faced what became known as the Great Carrying Place, a series of portages between ponds that required soldiers to haul boats and supplies overland for miles through swamp and dense forest, sometimes carrying loads of 180 pounds per man across ground that swallowed a boot with every step. Rain fell constantly through October, swelling the rivers, flooding the portage trails and soaking every scrap of gunpowder, clothing and food the men carried. Then came the storm. On the 21st of October, a massive rainstorm struck the region, dumping enormous volumes of water into the Dead River, the final major waterway before the height of land separating Maine from the Chaudière Valley. The river rose more than 8 feet in a matter of hours, sweeping away boats, drowning supplies, and flooding the camps where exhausted soldiers had pitched their tents for the night. Men woke up in the middle of the night, wading through their own campsites. Food that had already been rationed down to almost nothing was now ruined by water damage. It was at this exact moment, roughly 2/3 of the way through the march, with morale collapsing and supplies effectively gone, that Arnold made the decision that would define the rest of the expedition. He called a council of his officers and asked for volunteers to push ahead with the strongest men and the fastest boats to reach the French-Canadian settlements on the far side of the height of land and send food back to the rest of the army before it starved entirely. Here is the detail that gets lost in most retellings of this story. Arnold did not turn back. Almost every rational calculation available to him in that moment argued for retreat. His maps were wrong, his boats were failing, his men were out of food. A storm had just destroyed 1/3 of what remained of his supplies. Any conventional commander would have ordered a withdrawal back down the Kennebec to the safety of the Maine settlements. Arnold looked at the same information and decided that turning back now, with his men this exhausted and this far from any supply base in either direction, was more dangerous than continuing forward. He was betting the lives of every man under his command on the idea that pressing ahead gave them better odds than retreating. It was the kind of decision that looks either brilliant or insane, depending entirely on whether it works. Then came the moment that nearly ended the entire expedition before it accomplished anything at all. Colonel Roger Enos, commanding the rear division of roughly 450 men, along with most of the expedition's remaining food supplies, held his own council with his officers at the height of the crisis. The vote was close, but the decision was made. Enos turned his entire division around and marched back toward Massachusetts, taking a significant portion of the army's food with him. Some later accused Enos of outright cowardice. Others argued he made the only defensible decision available, since continuing forward with insufficient supplies for even his own men risked adding hundreds more starving soldiers to a column that already could not feed itself. Enos would face a court-martial for his decision after returning to Massachusetts, and he would be acquitted, but the damage to Arnold's expedition was already done. In a single afternoon, Arnold's force had been cut by roughly 300 men, and the survivors pushing forward now had even less food to divide among themselves. Roughly 600 men remained, and what followed was the worst stretch of the entire march. The height of land crossing into the Chaudière watershed was a nightmare of swamp, fallen timber, and freezing rain that turned to sleet and then to snow as October gave way to November. Men were eating candles. They boiled their own moccasins and shoe leather into a kind of broth just to put something warm in their stomachs. A dog belonging to one of the officers was killed, butchered, and eaten, and soldiers later wrote that they fought over the bones. Soldiers began collapsing from exhaustion and simply being left behind, propped against trees by comrades who no longer had the strength to carry them and could not spare the food to keep them alive. Disease spread through the ranks, dysentery in particular, made worse by men drinking from streams contaminated by the animals, and waste of hundreds of soldiers who had passed the same way days earlier. Desertion accelerated. Small groups slipped away from the column, gambling that finding their own way back to Maine gave them better odds than continuing forward into unknown territory with no food. Arnold pushed ahead of the main body with a small advance party, using the last serviceable boats to reach the French-Canadian settlements along the Chaudière River days before the rest of the army arrived. What he found there may have saved the entire expedition. The Chaudière River, once reached, dropped steeply toward the St. Lawrence Valley, and Arnold's advance party covered the final stretch in a fraction of the time the earlier portages had taken, riding the current down toward French settlements that had never seen an American soldier in their lives. Arnold immediately began purchasing cattle, flour, and whatever provisions the local French-Canadian farmers would sell, and sent them back up the trail to the starving Maine column. For the exhausted stragglers still stumbling down out of the wilderness, some of them days from death by starvation, the sight of cattle being driven up the trail toward them was almost more than they could process. Survivors later described grown men weeping at the sight of food. By the time the last stragglers reached the Chaudière settlements in early November, the expedition had been reduced from roughly 1,100 men who left Newburyport to somewhere around 600 who reached Quebec, and many of those men arrived barely able to stand, their clothing in rags, their feet wrapped in whatever scraps of leather and cloth they could find. It had taken 45 days to cross terrain Arnold had expected to cross in 20. And yet, against every reasonable expectation, an American army had just marched through one of the most brutal wildernesses on the continent and arrived, however battered, within sight of the walls of Quebec City. What happened next is where this story takes its final bitter turn. Arnold's ragged force linked up with General Richard Montgomery's army, which had successfully captured Montreal after its own campaign along Lake Champlain. Combined, the two forces still numbered barely 1,200 men, and they now faced the daunting prospect of assaulting one of the most heavily fortified cities in North America, defended by a garrison under British Governor Guy Carleton in the depths of a Canadian winter, with enlistments for many of the American soldiers set to expire on the 31st of December. On the night of the 30th of December, during a blinding snowstorm, Montgomery and Arnold launched a desperate two-pronged assault on the lower town of Quebec. Montgomery was killed almost immediately by grape shot fired from a barricade defended by a small British force. Arnold, leading his own column through narrow streets under fire, took a musket ball through the leg early in the assault and had to be carried from the field. Daniel Morgan took command of Arnold's column, fought his way deep into the lower town, and was eventually surrounded and forced to surrender, along with much of the remaining assault force. The attack failed. Nearly 500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in a single catastrophic night, a staggering toll for a force that had already been reduced to a fraction of its original strength by the march alone. Arnold, wounded and furious, refused to abandon the siege. He maintained a skeleton blockade of Quebec through the brutal winter of 1776 with a shrinking, freezing, smallpox-ravaged remnant of an army, waiting for reinforcements that arrived too slowly and in too few numbers to change the outcome. By the spring, British reinforcements arrived by sea, and the remaining American forces were pushed back out of Canada entirely, retreating in a chaotic and disease-riddled withdrawal that cost nearly as many lives as the original march through Maine had. The Quebec expedition, by almost any conventional measure, was a total failure. Canada was never brought into the rebellion. The 14th colony that Washington and Congress had hoped to add to the cause remained firmly in British hands for the rest of the war and for more than 2 centuries afterward. And yet, historians have never treated this campaign as a footnote. The march through the Maine wilderness is still studied as one of the most extraordinary feats of physical endurance in American military history, a campaign in which the terrain and the weather killed and broke more men than the enemy ever did, and in which an army pressed forward through conditions that should have destroyed it entirely, arriving battered but intact at a walled city 3,000 miles from where any of them had grown up. For Benedict Arnold himself, the expedition became the first chapter in a legend of raw physical courage that would follow him for years, long before it curdled into something darker. He had led men through a wilderness that broke their bodies and refused to turn back when turning back would have been the reasonable choice. He had been shot leading an assault on a fortress he had no realistic chance of taking. Washington himself praised Arnold's conduct on the march as an undertaking that would always be considered a most extraordinary example of patience, perseverance, and intrepidity. 5 years later, that same man would try to sell the fortress at West Point to the British for money. But in the winter of 1775, marching through swamps with his boots falling apart and his men eating candle wax to survive, Benedict Arnold was, by every account available, one of the most physically courageous officers in the entire Continental Army. History rarely lets a man stay a hero, but for one brutal, freezing march through the wilderness of Maine, Arnold earned it completely. If this story pulled you in, hit subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. And drop a comment telling us whether you think Arnold should have turned back when Enos did, or whether pushing forward was the right call even knowing how it ended.